Charles Benson, a well-respected CEO known for his innovative leadership, stood at the top of his game. From his corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows, he could see the bustling city below, a city his company, Tech Vision, helped shape with its cutting-edge AI solutions. Despite the growing success, Charles couldn't shake a growing unease in his gut. The company's numbers looked incredible, but something beneath the surface felt off. Employees seemed less engaged, and there were murmurs of dissatisfaction. He had heard rumors about strained relationships, overworked teams, and worst of all, a toxic culture lurking where he couldn't see. One fateful day, he sat with his most trusted executives, Jessica, head of HR, and Marcus, the COO. Their expressions mirrored the pit forming in Charles' stomach. The employee satisfaction survey was in, and the results were troubling. Work-life balance, feeling valued, trust in management, all down. Jessica reported, her voice wavering slightly as she pulled up graph after graph on her tablet. The air felt thick with tension. Charles stared at the data, his brow furrowed. Something deeper was wrong, but how could he fix it without understanding the real problems? Suddenly, an old memory surfaced, words from his mentor that had stuck with him for years. You can't know a company until you've walked a mile in the shoes of its lowest-paid employee. An idea sparked, so radical that his team looked at him in disbelief when he voiced it. "I'm going undercover, as a janitor," Charles announced, causing Marcus to burst out laughing. But Charles wasn't joking. His determination was written all over his face. It was time to get his hands dirty, literally, and see what was happening within his own company. The next week, Charles transformed. Gone was the polished CEO, replaced by Charlie, a janitor with thick glasses, a short beard, and a worn uniform. His heart pounded as he stepped into Tech Vision's bustling office building, this time not through the executive entrance, but through the basement, where the janitors, unseen and unnoticed, quietly made their way to work every day. Charles' pulse raced with excitement and nervousness, but nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to discover. The first test came at the security desk. The guard barely glanced up, muttering, "ID badge, please." Charles handed over his temporary badge, feeling a knot in his stomach. He was in. Down in the basement, harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Charles met Doris, the supervisor of the janitorial team. "You must be the new guy," she grumbled, barely sparing him a glance. Doris was tough, her back bent slightly from years of hauling heavy buckets and worn-out equipment. She snorted when he asked her what it was like to work here. "Invisible," she said bitterly. "Just like you'll be." Those words hit harder than he expected. Had he created a company where hardworking people felt this unseen? It didn't take long for Charles to understand just how invisible he had become. Employees brushed past him in the lobby, barely acknowledging his existence. Even when he held doors open or cleaned around them, they offered nothing more than a quick nod or a mumbled, "Thanks." One woman even pointed at a spill near the elevator, barely meeting his eyes as she snapped, "Clean that up, will you?" Charles obliged, but the reality of his disguise was sinking in. His heart sank further when he overheard his management team, people he had trusted to uphold the values of the company, joking cruelly about customer service complaints and dismissing ideas from junior employees with condescension. One voice in particular stung. Linda, his head of operations, laughed about having to deal with whining from employees, belittling the very people who helped build the company. As the day wore on, Charles's view of his company continued to darken. He noticed stark differences between teams. The younger, tech-savvy groups buzzed with energy, surrounded by the latest gadgets, while the older employees, segregated to a different corner of the office, worked on outdated equipment in near silence. Favoritism was clear as day. It wasn't just about talent anymore. It was about who you knew and how you fit the image. His heart broke as he realized that he had allowed this culture to fester right under his nose. One particularly sobering moment came when Charles bumped into Linda in the hallway. Without recognizing him, she coldly berated him for spilling supplies from his janitor's cart, her tone dripping with disdain. "Can't you be more careful? Some of us have important work to do here," she snapped, her voice cutting through him like a knife. The woman who once inspired him with her compassion and leadership was now cold, ruthless, and focused only on results. But amidst the gloom, Charles found glimmers of hope. He met Henry, an IT worker who treated everyone with kindness, whether it was a struggling intern or the cleaning staff. Henry helped without hesitation, always with a smile and a belief that everyone deserves to be noticed. It was people like Henry who reminded Charles that Tech Vision still had a chance to be the company he had envisioned, a place where talent, hard work, and kindness were valued. Then there was Angela, a senior accountant working late into the night. Exhausted but dedicated, she combed through spreadsheets, fixing errors that could have cost the company millions. But her dedication came at a personal cost, missing family events, including her son's soccer game. Charles overheard her phone call, the pain in her voice unmistakable as she apologized to her son for being absent once again. "I'll make it up to you," she whispered, though the guilt in her voice made it clear that she was unsure if she could. As the days passed, Charles saw the full spectrum of his company, the good, the bad, and the downright ugly. He watched as younger employees cruelly mocked their older colleagues, dismissing them as out of touch. One group even joked about Dinosaur Donna, an older woman who had clearly overheard their hurtful words but said nothing, simply retreating to her desk in silence. It was bullying, plain and simple, and it filled Charles with anger and shame. Then there were the real heartbreaks, like Terrence, a longtime employee who confided in Charles that he was about to lose his home due to mounting medical bills. He had given years to the company, missed his children's birthdays, and worked through holidays. Yet when he asked for help, HR handed him pamphlets on financial planning and sent him on his way. Charles felt a surge of guilt. How had he allowed this to happen? How had his company become so disconnected from the needs of its employees? By the end of his undercover week, Charles had seen enough. He couldn't ignore the problems anymore. The favoritism, the toxic leadership, the employees who were suffering in silence. It was time to act. The next day, Tech Vision employees were called to an emergency meeting. They shuffled into the auditorium, confused and curious about the sudden company-wide announcement. When Charles stepped onto the stage, there were gasps of recognition. Some people's jaws dropped as they realized who the janitor had been all along. "I wasn't on a leadership retreat," Charles began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I've been here, among you, disguised as a janitor. I needed to see for myself what this company had become." The room fell silent. Charles shared stories of the incredible kindness and dedication he had witnessed, like Henry's unwavering support for his colleagues and Angela's tireless work ethic. But he also revealed the harsh truths about the toxic culture that had taken root. Linda's ruthless behavior, the favoritism in promotions, and the casual cruelty he had witnessed firsthand. "I've let you down," Charles said, his voice filled with regret. "This company has lost its way, and that's my failure as a leader. But today, we start to make things right." The room was still, tension palpable as everyone waited to hear what would come next. Charles then turned to Linda, who sat in the audience, her face pale with shock. He called her to the stage, recounting the moment when she berated him, unaware that she was speaking to the CEO. Tears welled in Linda's eyes as she realized the impact of her actions. "I don't know when I became this person," she whispered, her voice trembling with guilt. But Charles didn't fire her. Instead, he gave her a second chance, a chance to change, to lead with compassion rather than fear. "We're going to rebuild this company's culture from the ground up," he announced, his voice filled with determination. "And it starts today." Charles laid out his plan: an anonymous reporting system for workplace concerns, an overhaul of performance reviews and promotions, and a new focus on empathy and ethical leadership. No more would promotions be based on who fit a certain image. No more would loyal employees like Terrence go unnoticed. The employees erupted into applause as Charles finished his speech, the slow clap starting from Henry, who stood with tears in his eyes. One by one, others rose to their feet, and soon the entire auditorium was on its feet, applauding not just for Charles, but for the change they all hoped to see. As the crowd began to disperse, Charles sought out the people who had impacted him the most. He found Terrence, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I want to talk to you about your situation. We're going to make this right," Charles said softly, and Terrence, too overcome with emotion, simply nodded. Then there was Angela, who looked stunned as Charles offered her a promotion she had long deserved. "Your hard work hasn't gone unnoticed," he told her, watching the tears of gratitude fill her eyes. And finally, Charles made his way to Henry. "Thank you for reminding me what this company should be about," he said, his voice filled with appreciation. Henry smiled broadly, the joy unmistakable on his face. In the days and weeks that followed, the culture at TechVision began to change. Employees, once fearful of speaking up, started to find their voices. New initiatives were rolled out, leadership training focused on empathy became mandatory, and Charles made sure he stayed connected to the people at every level of his company. Linda, humbled by the experience, took on a new role, leading training sessions on ethical leadership, determined to correct the mistakes she had made. Meanwhile, Angela, now in a leadership position, led her team with compassion and collaboration, a stark contrast to the fear-driven leadership that had once ruled. Charles himself became more present than ever, hosting informal coffee with the CEO sessions, where employees from every department were encouraged to share their thoughts, ideas, and concerns directly with him. One day, as he walked through the building, he paused in front of the company's mission statement. "At TechVision, we strive to innovate not just in technology, but in how we work together as a team." Those words, once corporate jargon, now had real meaning to Charles. He had learned that true leadership wasn't about driving profits or expanding markets. It was about creating an environment where people could thrive, where kindness and collaboration were valued above all else. As he left the building that day, a sense of peace washed over him. The road ahead would be long, and there would be challenges, but for the first time in years, Charles was excited for the future. Not as the distant CEO behind a desk, but as a leader who truly understood what it meant to serve his people. And as he drove home that night, he couldn't help but smile, knowing that TechVision was finally on the right path, a company not just focused on innovation, but on creating a workplace where everyone could shine. Charles couldn't shake the sense of profound transformation that had taken hold of him and his company. TechVision had changed, was changing. And for the first time in years, he felt that the company was truly aligning with the vision he had dreamed of from the very beginning. But as anyone who has walked the path of leadership knows, the road is never smooth, and challenges lie in wait at every turn. As the days went on, the initial excitement and momentum from the meeting began to settle, and the real work of culture change started. Charles knew that unveiling new policies was only the first step. Now, he had to ensure they were implemented effectively. His undercover boss mission had opened his eyes, but it also meant he could no longer remain hidden. He was back in the limelight, and with that came a new set of challenges. At the next executive meeting, Charles stood before his senior leadership team with a resolute look. "The changes we've announced are only the beginning," he said firmly. "This isn't a one-time fix. It's a complete overhaul, and I need each of you to take responsibility in your departments. We need to rebuild trust, and that starts with you." He scanned the room, his gaze landing on each of his leaders. Marcus, Jessica, and yes, even Linda, who was still coming to terms with the aftermath of her previous behavior. Linda, her once unshakable confidence, now tempered with humility, spoke up. "Charles, I've been thinking a lot since that day," she admitted quietly, her voice tinged with regret. "I see now how disconnected I became. It's not easy to face, but I want to be part of the solution. I want to change the way we lead." There was an air of sincerity in her tone, a woman who had realized her mistakes and was now ready to atone for them. Charles nodded in approval, his own heart heavy with the knowledge that rebuilding trust wouldn't happen overnight. Meanwhile, Angela, now firmly entrenched in her new role, was beginning to shine as a leader. Where Linda had once ruled with fear and intimidation, Angela led with kindness and collaboration. Her office became a hub of activity, her team inspired by her ability to balance empathy with accountability. One afternoon, as Charles walked by her office, he overheard her talking with one of her newer employees. "You're not here just to check boxes and hit targets," Angela said with warmth in her voice. "You're here to think, to innovate, to bring your ideas to the table. That's what makes TechVision great." Charles smiled to himself as he walked past, feeling a deep sense of pride. Angela was the future of the company, someone who truly understood what leadership was supposed to look like. However, not all the changes were being embraced with the same enthusiasm. There were murmurs of resistance among some of the middle management employees who had grown comfortable with the old ways of doing things, ways that rewarded favoritism and allowed toxic behaviors to go unchecked. Charles had anticipated this, but it didn't make it any easier to tackle. At a follow-up meeting with the leadership team, Marcus, who had always been the numbers guy, voiced his concerns. "Charles, I get that we're trying to change the culture, but we also need to focus on results. We can't afford to lose sight of our financial goals while we're overhauling everything else." Charles looked at him, understanding where he was coming from. He respected Marcus' pragmatism, but this time, his focus was different. "Marcus, I agree results are important, but what good are results if we're burning out our people, losing trust, and fostering an environment that's toxic? It's a short-term gain for long-term failure. We need to build a company that sustains both our people and our profits." Jessica, who had remained quiet until this point, chimed in. "I've been hearing a lot of feedback from the employees," she said thoughtfully. "There's excitement, but also fear. Fear that this is all just talk, that things will go back to the way they were once the buzz dies down." Charles leaned forward. "That's why it's so important we don't just talk. We act. Every decision, every policy, every conversation from this point on needs to reflect the values we want to build. The trust we lost will only be regained by consistently doing the right thing. Every day." In the weeks that followed, Charles made it his mission to stay visible. He visited departments he hadn't set foot in for years, holding informal discussions with employees, listening to their concerns, and offering them a platform to speak openly. He remembered Henry's words about how a little kindness could go a long way, and how invisible employees often felt in the grander scheme of things. Charles made sure that everyone, from the janitors to the engineers, knew they were seen and valued. One morning, Charles walked through the engineering floor, a part of the company where he had once spent so much of his time in the early days of tech vision. Now, the place felt both familiar and foreign. He saw May, the young product developer who had struggled to get her ideas heard, sitting at her desk with a thoughtful expression. "May," Charles greeted her warmly. "How are things coming along?" May looked up, a bit startled but pleased by the attention. "It's going well, Mr. Benson." Charles," she corrected herself nervously. "I've been working on the new accessibility features we talked about, and I think we're on to something really promising." Charles smiled, remembering how timid she had been the first time he had seen her trying to speak up. "That's fantastic. I'd love to see it in action when you're ready. Don't hesitate to bring your ideas to the table. You're part of this team, and your voice matters." May's face brightened. "I'll make sure to get it ready for the next presentation," she said confidently, a far cry from the shy developer who once struggled to be heard. But not every interaction was as uplifting. One afternoon, Charles encountered an uncomfortable situation while passing by the cafeteria. A group of younger employees were snickering and making rude comments about an older colleague as they gathered around the coffee machine. It reminded him of the incident he had witnessed with Dinosaur Donna, and it filled him with the same sense of disgust. Stepping into the conversation, Charles didn't hold back. "That's not the kind of behavior we tolerate here," he said, his voice firm but controlled. The group of employees fell silent, shamefaced as they realized who had overheard them. "If you have issues with a colleague, you discuss them professionally. We don't tear each other down here. This is not the culture we're building." As he walked away, he hoped the message had sunk in. Changing a culture meant confronting uncomfortable truths, and sometimes it required direct action to correct behavior. The next few months became a whirlwind of progress and setbacks, breakthroughs and frustrations. The leadership training sessions were met with mixed reactions. Some managers embraced the new approach wholeheartedly, while others resisted, clinging to the old ways of control and hierarchy. Charles knew it would take time, but he was determined to see it through. Linda, to her credit, had embraced her second chance with humility. She worked closely with Charles and Jessica to craft new policies, and though the sting of her public dressing down still haunted her, it had made her a better leader. She now led the ethical leadership training with a personal story, her own fall from grace and her journey back to compassionate leadership. One afternoon, Charles stopped by Linda's training session, watching from the back as she spoke to a room full of managers. Her voice was steady, her message clear. "We've all made mistakes," she said, "but what defines us is how we move forward from those mistakes. Leadership is about empathy, accountability, and making the hard decisions that put people first, even when it's not easy." Charles left the session feeling a sense of pride, not just in Linda, but in the resilience of his team. They were turning a corner, slowly but surely. As TechVision's culture continued to shift, so did the company's performance. Charles had worried that focusing on culture might take away from their financial goals, but to his surprise, the opposite happened. Productivity increased, innovation flourished, and turnover decreased. Employees who felt valued and heard were more engaged than ever before. The company's profits began to rise alongside its improving morale, proving that a healthy culture and strong financial performance were not mutually exclusive. 1 year after Charles' undercover journey, the transformation was undeniable. TechVision had not only regained its footing, it was thriving. The culture of fear and favoritism had been replaced with one of openness and respect. Employees from all levels were contributing ideas, and promotions were based on merit and innovation, not image. And yet, Charles knew the work wasn't over. Culture change is a never-ending journey, one that requires constant attention and dedication. But now, he had a team that understood that, and together, they were committed to making TechVision a place where everyone could succeed. As he stood in his office, gazing out over the city once again, Charles felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had set out to create a company that wasn't just profitable, but meaningful, a place where people could thrive, where their voices mattered, and where the culture reflected the values they held dear. TechVision had become that place. And for Charles, that was the true measure of success. As Charles stood by the window, reflecting on the journey TechVision had undergone, a sense of peace washed over him. But deep down, he knew that peace wasn't the end of the road. It was just a checkpoint. The company had indeed made strides, and its culture had improved. But Charles, ever the visionary, understood that the world of business, much like life, was unpredictable. Even with the best of intentions, challenges would continue to emerge. One evening, Charles received a call from Angela. Her voice, usually calm and composed, had a slight edge of urgency. "Charles, we've got a situation. There's been an issue with the new product line that we're about to launch. It's not technical, it's about how we're approaching it, and some of the engineers are raising concerns." Charles immediately felt his pulse quicken. "Tell me more," he said, his tone measured, though he felt the weight of the potential problem bearing down on him. Angela explained that some of the engineers had discovered that in the rush to meet deadlines, certain ethical considerations regarding user privacy had been overlooked. It wasn't a catastrophic issue yet, but if left unchecked, it could lead to significant problems down the road. Charles's mind raced back to Henry's earlier concerns about rushing a system through without proper security checks. He had learned from his undercover experience that sometimes the most vital insights come from those who aren't in the boardroom, but are working quietly behind the scenes. "Let's meet first thing tomorrow," Charles said decisively. "I want to hear from the engineers directly. We're not making the same mistakes we used to, Angela. If something needs to be addressed, we'll deal with it head on." The next morning, the meeting room was filled with a mix of senior leadership, project managers, and engineers. Charles noticed Henry sitting among them, and his presence gave him a sense of confidence. Here was someone who wouldn't hesitate to speak the truth. The discussion began calmly, but it didn't take long for tensions to surface. One of the engineers, a soft-spoken woman named Priya, was the first to voice her concerns. The new product, as it stands now, could potentially collect user data in ways that are too invasive. We've tried to raise these concerns through the usual channels, but deadlines are being pushed so hard that we haven't had time to address them properly. Marcus, ever the pragmatic voice, spoke up. We have contracts to fulfill, Priya. Delays cost money, and we're already behind. Priya, her face pale but determined, replied, I understand that, but this is about trust. If we release something that doesn't align with our values, we could lose more than just money. We'll lose our credibility. The room fell silent, tension hanging thick in the air. Charles took a deep breath. This was one of those pivotal moments that define not only leadership but the direction of a company. He could feel the pressure from both sides. On one hand, the business need to meet deadlines, and on the other, the ethical responsibility to protect users and uphold the company's newfound principles. Priya's right, Charles finally said, his voice clear and unwavering. We can't sacrifice long-term trust for short-term gains. If there are concerns about the product's ethical implications, then we pause, we investigate, and we fix it before moving forward. Marcus looked at Charles with a mixture of respect and concern. But Charles, we're already committed to a launch date. If we delay, we're going to take a hit with the investors. Charles nodded, understanding the financial stakes. I get it, Marcus. But what's the point of all this change we've worked for, everything we've built over the past year? If we compromise our values now, investors may be unhappy with a delay, but they'll be a lot more upset if we release a product that backfires and damages our reputation. Henry, who had remained quiet until now, finally spoke up. Charles is right. If we prioritize speed over integrity, we're no better than the companies that cut corners. We've been given an opportunity to build something better, to lead by example. That's what Tech Vision should stand for. The room seemed to exhale collectively, the tension easing as Charles made the final decision. We'll address the privacy concerns. We'll communicate with our investors about why this delay is necessary. Our priority is trust, and if we stay true to that, the rest will follow. It wasn't an easy choice, but it was the right one. And as word of the decision spread throughout the company, Charles felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about a product or a deadline. It was about the identity of Tech Vision, and what kind of company it aspired to be. In the days that followed, the engineers worked tirelessly to address the privacy concerns, and Charles made sure to be involved every step of the way, offering support where it was needed. The revised product was ultimately launched a few weeks later, with full transparency about the reasons for the delay. To Charles's relief, the reaction from the public and the investors was overwhelmingly positive. The trust that Tech Vision had earned over the past year wasn't just intact, it had grown. But for Charles, the real victory wasn't in the product launch. It was in the culture that had taken root. Employees felt empowered to speak up, to challenge decisions, and to prioritize values over convenience. Leaders like Angela, Henry, and even Linda had stepped up, embodying the principles that now guided the company. One day, as Charles made his rounds through the office, he found himself back in the janitorial area, where his undercover journey had begun. The fluorescent lights still buzzed overhead, the equipment still looked worn, but something had changed. Doris, the gruff janitor supervisor who had once dismissed him so casually, spotted Charles and gave him a nod of recognition. She approached him with a cautious smile, a stark contrast to the indifference she had shown when he was Charlie. "You've been keeping busy, Mr. Benson," she said, her voice less rough than he remembered. Charles smiled back. "Trying to make things better, Doris. Trying to make sure everyone gets seen." She let out a gruff chuckle, but there was warmth in her eyes. "Well, I've been here long enough to see a lot of bosses come and go. Most of them don't care about the people who keep this place running. But you did something different. Never thought I'd see the day." Charles was struck by the simplicity and power of her words. "Thanks, Doris. It means a lot coming from you." As he walked back through the building, passing by employees who smiled and waved, Charles couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought him here. Tech Vision had changed, and so had he. The road had been long, filled with missteps, hard lessons, and uncomfortable truths, but the company was finally becoming what he had always hoped it would be, a place where every voice mattered, where trust was the foundation, and where success wasn't measured just by profits, but by the lives they touched. And yet, Charles knew the work wasn't over. It never would be. Leadership wasn't about reaching a destination. It was about continuing the journey, about learning and growing alongside the people you serve. It was about being willing to listen, to admit when you were wrong, and to make things right, even when it was hard. As the evening sun began to set, casting long shadows across the city, Charles stood once more at his window. He no longer saw just a city of concrete and glass. He saw a community, a web of people connected by their work, their dreams, and their shared purpose. Tech Vision had become more than just a company. It had become a beacon of what was possible when leaders chose integrity over expediency, compassion over control, and hope over fear. And with that thought, Charles turned away from the window, ready to face whatever tomorrow would bring. Because now, more than ever, he understood what true leadership was all about. It wasn't about being in charge, it was about taking care of those in your charge. It was about lifting people up, about giving them the tools to succeed, and about creating a legacy of trust and respect that would endure long after he was gone. As he closed the door to his office that evening, Charles knew that the real story of Tech Vision had only just begun. And this time, it would be a story worth telling. Charles left the office that evening with a renewed sense of purpose, yet also with a calm he hadn't felt in years. The battle for Tech Vision's soul had been hard fought, and while he knew it was far from over, the foundations had been laid. But he was also wise enough to know that the road ahead would continue to be filled with challenges, some foreseeable, others lurking just beyond the horizon. In the days that followed, Charles found himself walking through different departments more often than he had in the past. His visits weren't just for formal meetings or updates anymore. They were moments to connect with the people who made Tech Vision what it was. He had learned from his Undercover experience that the most valuable insights often came from the most unexpected places, and he was determined not to lose touch with that again. One afternoon, Charles made his way to the break room. As he entered, he noticed Henry, the IT specialist whose kindness had deeply touched him during his undercover mission, sitting with a few younger employees. They were engaged in an animated discussion about a new project they were working on. Henry noticed Charles entering and smiled warmly. "Hey, Mr. Benson." "Sorry, Charles," Henry said, catching himself. "Come join us. We were just talking about how to implement some new features into our system." Charles joined the group, grabbing a cup of coffee as he sat down. "What's the latest? I'm always interested in hearing what you guys are working on." The group of younger employees lit up, excited to share their ideas with the CEO. They talked about streamlining some internal systems to make collaboration easier, automating certain processes, and improving user interfaces. But more than the technical details, what struck Charles was the enthusiasm in the room. There was a palpable sense of empowerment among these employees, a far cry from the stifling atmosphere that had once plagued the company. At the end of the discussion, one of the newer employees, a young woman named Chloe, hesitated before speaking. "I just want to say, it's been really inspiring to see how much things have changed here. I've only been at Tech Vision for about 6 months, but I've heard from some of the longer-term staff about how difficult things used to be. It feels different now. Better." Charles smiled, feeling a surge of pride. "That's good to hear, Chloe, but remember, it's all of us. Every person in this company that makes this place what it is. The change doesn't happen because of just one person. It happens when we all decide to make things better together." Chloe nodded, clearly moved by his words, and the group returned to their conversation. Charles stayed for a few more minutes before excusing himself, his heart full. It was these small moments of connection that meant the most to him now. The grand speeches and boardroom meetings were important, but it was the individual relationships that sustained a culture of trust and collaboration. Later that week, Charles received an invitation from an unlikely source, Linda. Since her public reckoning, Linda had thrown herself into her new role, working hard to rebuild trust with her colleagues and even taking on the challenge of running ethical leadership workshops. Now, she wanted Charles to attend one of the sessions she was leading. Curious and eager to see how Linda had been handling her transformation, Charles accepted the invitation. When he arrived at the training session, the room was already buzzing with conversation. Managers from various departments sat in a semicircle, discussing leadership strategies and sharing personal stories. Linda stood at the front, her demeanor noticeably different from the stern, high-powered executive she had once been. Linda began the session with a vulnerable admission. "I want to start by saying that I'm not here as someone who has all the answers. In fact, I'm standing here because I've made my share of mistakes, serious ones. But what I've learned is that leadership isn't about being perfect. It's about being willing to acknowledge when you've messed up, to ask for forgiveness, and to work to earn back the trust you've lost." The room was silent, captivated by Linda's honesty. Charles could see the shift in how people regarded her. No longer was she the feared and distant leader, but someone who had been humbled and was now working to lead with empathy. It was exactly what he had hoped for when he'd given her that second chance. As the session went on, Linda invited the managers to share their own experiences, times when they had struggled with leadership, when they had faced ethical dilemmas, or when they had to navigate difficult conversations with their teams. The atmosphere was one of openness and mutual support, a far cry from the cutthroat culture that had once dominated these rooms. When the session concluded, Linda approached Charles, a slight nervousness in her step. "Thank you for coming, Charles," she said quietly. "I wasn't sure how this would go, but I really appreciate you being here." Charles smiled. "You did great, Linda. The way you're leading now, it's a testament to how far you've come. I'm proud of the work you're doing, and I'm even more proud of the fact that you're not afraid to show your vulnerability. That's real leadership." Linda smiled, clearly moved by his words. "I've still got a long way to go, but I'm getting there. Thanks for believing in me when I didn't even believe in myself." As they parted ways, Charles felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Linda's growth wasn't just her own success, it was a reflection of the changes happening across TechVision. People were learning, evolving, and embracing a new way of leading. Weeks passed, and TechVision continued to thrive, both culturally and financially. The once rampant turnover rate had decreased dramatically, and employee engagement was at an all-time high. Innovation flourished as employees felt empowered to share their ideas and collaborate across departments. It was the kind of workplace Charles had always envisioned, but had never quite managed to realize. Until now. One day, as Charles was leaving a meeting, he was stopped by Terrence, the loyal employee who had once confided in him during his undercover mission about his personal struggles. Terrence now looked healthier, more relaxed, and had a light in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "Charles," Terrence said, his voice filled with gratitude. "I just wanted to thank you again for everything. You and the company gave me the support I needed to get through a really tough time. I've been able to focus on my work and my family, and it's made all the difference." Charles smiled warmly. "You've earned it, Terrence. You've given so much to this company, and it's about time we recognize that." Terrence hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "Actually, there's something else. I've been thinking about how much I've learned in my time here, and I wanted to see if I could get involved in some of the new initiatives around mentoring younger employees. I feel like I've got a lot to give back." Charles felt a surge of pride. This was what real transformation looked like. Employees not just finding their place, but stepping up to lift others as well. "I think that's a fantastic idea," Charles said. "I'll talk to HR and we'll get you set up to mentor some of the new hires. They could learn a lot from you." Terrence grinned, clearly excited by the opportunity. "Thanks, Charles. I'm looking forward to it." As Terrence walked away, Charles couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction. The changes at TechVision weren't just surface level, they were ingrained in the very fabric of the company now. Employees like Terrence were thriving, not just because the work environment had improved, but because they were being given opportunities to grow, lead, and make a difference. As the weeks turned into months, Charles continued to focus on keeping the momentum going. He knew that culture wasn't something you could set and forget. It needed constant nurturing, attention, and reinforcement. But for the first time in years, he felt confident that TechVision was on the right path, not just because of the policies they had implemented, but because the people who made up the company had embraced the values that mattered most. And so, TechVision's story continued, a story of transformation, resilience, and hope. A company that had once lost its way had found its footing again, not just in the world of technology, but in the hearts and minds of its employees. And as for Charles, he knew that his role as a leader wasn't about being the hero of the story. It was about empowering others to become heroes in their own right, to lead with integrity, kindness, and purpose. In the end, that was the true legacy of TechVision, a place where every person, from the CEO to the janitor, could find their voice, be valued for who they were, and contribute to something greater than themselves. And for Charles Benson, that was success worth far more than any profit margin or quarterly report ever could be. It was the kind of success that lasted, one that transformed lives and built a company that could weather any storm. Charles Benson's decision to go undercover had been a gamble, a risk that could have exposed his weaknesses as a leader, or worse, caused his employees to lose trust in him entirely. But as the days passed and the impact of his revelation settled in, it became clear that his bold move had not only saved the company, but had also sparked a transformation far deeper than anyone had anticipated. Weeks after his public confession, Charles still felt the ripples of his actions. Conversations were more open, and employees from all levels of the company felt empowered to share their thoughts. The shift wasn't just about policies, it was about culture, about how people interacted with each other, and how leadership was now seen as a shared responsibility rather than a top-down hierarchy. One morning, Charles received an email that caught him off guard. It was from an employee he had never met, someone deep in the R&D department, who had been with the company for less than a year. The email was simple, but the words hit home. "Thank you for making us feel seen. I used to be afraid of speaking up, but now I believe my voice matters. I've never worked at a place like this before." That short note stayed with Charles. It was a reminder that real leadership wasn't about grand gestures or public speeches. It was about the small, everyday decisions that made people feel valued. And so, he continued his mission to walk through the offices, to sit in on meetings that weren't part of his usual agenda, to ask questions, and most importantly, to listen. But despite the changes, Charles knew that not everyone had fully embraced the new direction. There were still pockets of resistance, people who were stuck in the old way of doing things, unwilling to let go of their power or adapt to the more transparent and collaborative culture that was taking shape. One afternoon, Jessica, the head of HR, came to him with concerns. "Charles, I've been hearing from some of the managers that they're struggling with the new expectations. Some of them, well, they just don't get it. They're used to leading through control and fear, and they don't know how to transition into this new model." Charles leaned back in his chair, the weight of her words sinking in. He had known this would happen, that some leaders would resist the changes, clinging to their old habits. But now that it was here, it felt like a critical moment. He couldn't let these managers undermine the progress they had made, but he also didn't want to alienate them completely. "What do you think we should do?" Charles asked, valuing Jessica's insight. Jessica hesitated for a moment. "I think it's time for some tough conversations," she said. "We need to sit down with the managers who are struggling and really walk them through what's expected. And if they can't adapt, well, maybe it's time to consider whether they belong at TechVision." Charles nodded. It wasn't easy, but Jessica was right. The company had come too far to let a few holdouts drag them back into the old ways. "Let's start scheduling those meetings," he said. "I'll be there for every single one." In the days that followed, Charles and Jessica met with several of the company's senior managers, people who had been with TechVision for years, some even since the very beginning. The conversations were difficult, and not everyone took the news well. There were arguments, defensiveness, and even anger from a few who felt that the new culture threatened their authority. One such meeting stood out in Charles's memory. He sat across from a manager named Darren, who had run one of the company's most successful teams for years. Darren had always been a hardliner, someone who believed that fear was the best motivator and that results were all that mattered. He had never been one to mince words, and today was no different. "Charles, I've been running this team since day one," Darren said, his tone sharp. And we've delivered results. What you're doing now, it's soft. All this talk about empathy and collaboration, it's not how you build a competitive company. Charles listened calmly, but inside his patience was wearing thin. He had expected resistance, but hearing it so bluntly still stung. Darren, I respect the results your team has produced, Charles said, choosing his words carefully. But results aren't the only thing that matter. We can't afford to burn people out or drive them away just because we're pushing for the next big thing. This isn't just about being competitive in the short term, it's about building a company that lasts. Darren leaned back, crossing his arms. You really think you can do both? Be nice to people and still win in this industry? Charles's gaze was steady. Yes, I do. And we're already seeing it. The teams that have embraced this new culture are not only more productive, but they're also happier, more engaged. They're coming up with better ideas because they're not afraid to speak up. Darren was silent for a moment, the tension between them thick in the air. Finally he spoke, but his voice had lost its edge. I don't know if I can lead like that, Charles. It's not who I am. Charles nodded, appreciating the honesty. I understand. But this is where Tech Vision is going, Darren, and I need leaders who can adapt, who can grow with us. If you're not willing to try, then maybe this isn't the right place for you anymore. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and for a moment Charles wondered how Darren would respond. But then slowly, Darren shook his head. I've been here too long to change now. Maybe it's time for me to step aside. It wasn't the outcome Charles had hoped for, but he respected Darren's decision. They shook hands, and it wasn't the outcome Charles had hoped for, but he respected Darren's decision. They shook hands, and Darren left the company a few weeks later, leaving behind a legacy of hard work, but also a reminder that not everyone could come along for the journey. As the weeks passed, Charles continued to work with the leadership team to identify and support the managers who were struggling with the transition. Some, like Darren, chose to leave, while others embraced the change and found new ways to lead. It wasn't easy, but Charles knew that this was the hard work of culture change, work that couldn't be rushed or avoided. One day, as Charles walked through the office, he was struck by how different the atmosphere felt compared to just a year ago. Employees were engaged, laughing together, brainstorming new ideas, and working collaboratively in ways he hadn't seen before. There was an energy in the air, a sense of shared purpose and possibility that hadn't existed in the old Tech Vision. It wasn't just about the policies or the meetings. It was about the people. People like Henry, who had become a mentor to younger employees, helping them navigate the challenges of the tech world with kindness and patience. People like Angela, who is now leading her team with empathy and collaboration, embodying the values that Tech Vision had embraced. Even Linda, once the poster child for ruthless efficiency, had transformed into a leader who valued compassion and connection as much as results. As Charles reflected on the journey, he knew that the work was far from over. There would always be new challenges, new opportunities for growth, and new ways to improve. But for the first time in a long time, he felt confident that Tech Vision was on the right path. And so, with the sun setting over the city, casting a warm glow over the office, Charles made his way back to his desk. There was work to be done, but this time, it wasn't a burden, it was a privilege. A privilege to lead a company that wasn't just about innovation and profits, but about people. About creating a place where every voice mattered, where every contribution was valued, and where success wasn't just measured in dollars, but in the lives they touched. For Charles Benson, that was the kind of company worth leading, and that was the kind of legacy he wanted to leave behind.